Hey friends, Sunwarper here. Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're breaking down my latest setup for live performance using just Koala Sampler on a phone or iPad, and then, because it's my main sampler, the SP404. Now this workflow should work with any and all samplers, so if you have a couple of different setups, I'd recommend trying them all out and seeing what sampler or samplers you prefer and putting them together. So first we're going to go over how to route this whole setup, because there's a couple of different ways you can do it, especially with the 404 with all the different effects you can have and the different ways you route them. Then we'll talk a few different ways to utilize each of your sampler's strengths when creating the live set. And then finally we'll go over a few performance and general live set tips that really help me get my head around using just two samplers for a live set. And if you want to check out any of the gear that I'm using in this video, there are affiliate links in the description. So let's get into it. Here we are with the setup. It's pretty simple. The main sampler is Koala Sampler, and I'm bouncing between a few different tracks that I made in Koala Sampler and then just playing around with different patterns in each track. So I have one track here and there's multiple patterns, and we'll talk about the pattern sequencing in a little bit. From Koala, we go to the SP404. The SP works both as a sampler with specific tracks just on the SP, but it's also the main effects and mastering. All the audio that comes from Koala goes into the SP, and I can do effects, and then in bus 3 and 4, I've got cassette sim and compression. So let's talk about the routing. With the SP404, it seems quite simple. You have 4 buses. Well, you actually have 5 with input effects, but there's a few different ways you can move the routing around, and I actually employed a few different types during this live set and even switched between a few different things. The biggest one, input setting, I have 303 vinyl sim, and the comp's up pretty high. I've got some wow and flutter, and then I lowered the level a little bit. The 303 compression that high helps to kind of bring everything together. And then for the input bus, I have it go to bus 2. Rather than having it go to bus 1, this enables the SP tracks to be in bus 1. So this gives a way to have some really smooth transitions between the two. And then for most of the set, bus 1 and 2 run in parallel so that any sound from bus 2 does not treat bus 1 in any way. And real quick, just for bus 3 and 4 for the mastering, I didn't do any mastering in my DAW. So at the start of the track, I have the age at 0, but the wow and flutter at 32 on cassette sim. For the last song, which is really warped, nice little ambient track, I raised it to 8 while we were live. And then for bus 4, I've just got a compressor. Everything's at 0 except the level is brought down a little bit, and this just helps bring a bunch of balance to the sound and make sure that all the levels are pretty good. But it also bumps up the volume quite a bit and adds a ton of punch. Now that we've got the effects out of the way, let's talk about a few different ways you can use these samplers live together. And I think the best way to do that is just break down exactly how I used Koala and then the couple of different ways that I used the SP404. So Koala's pretty simple. When I made a beat, first I chopped it up, and then from there I just pattern sequenced, and how I place the patterns is very important to me when I'm playing live because I'm bouncing between different ones. So for this track, it actually starts with the drums because I'm fading them in as the track on the SP is ending. So then when I switch, it's got the first part, a cool little sample chop, and then I do some effects on the SP and switch to this one that has bass and some piano. And then I have this empty spot. The way I have it set for Koala is on these samples, I have them set to one-shot mode, so as soon as you trigger them, they'll play in full, however much of a track you have in this pad. So because of that, if I trigger those one-shots, when I switch to an empty pad, they keep playing, but everything else that's not a one-shot stops. And so it's a great way to do mutes without actually having to mute individual drums. Then I've got this B section. I have a B section with no drums. And then I have an alternate. It is still the B section, but it's a bit of a different progression. And then for some transitions, I actually used Koala's effects. Just raise the reverb, maybe filter it, and then you can switch to the next track over here. So that brings us to the SP, and the way that I'm using the SP is, well, there's two ways I use the SP. For one, I bounced whole patterns into a single pad and then just switch between them and have a mute group so that if I trigger one, trigger a different one, it stops that other one. Then on bus 2 for this track, I just have a snare from the track, a one shot, and then some little vocal samples that I made just to add some variety if I want it. And then for the track like Lost Coast, I actually use both buses, with bus 1 also having basically the full track, and then I just have guitar chops for the track on bus 2 so I can do some effects. That's the basic setup and how I'm using each of them, but I also want to just give a couple of general set tips which will come in handy with any type of samplers you're using, but especially when working with this setup, I found them very helpful. And so the first one is to map out your transitions, write the transitions, both the effects and whatever routing you're doing. So to illustrate how I write down my transitions, let me just show you one of the transitions I have. So I have this track that's on the SP, but we have a track on Koala that I have just start with drums. So I fade out the volume when this song is playing, and then they're close enough in BPM that you can make this work, but it would be much more ideal at the same BPM. This one's 98 on the SP and this one's 97 on Koala. So you really only get like one run through before it starts to get a little off sync. So you do want to keep that in mind. What I do is I go from that B section with the drums and I just switch over to just the A section with no drums because these drums are going to fade in. And then I just try to sync playing it. And then I fade in the drums. And then you want to watch when that goes because we're going to switch to that, but stop this. And there you go. That's a lot, right? What I do is I have it all written out on a piece of paper, and for each track I write what bus each track is supposed to be on, so I know where I'm supposed to be when I'm doing this transition. I also have what effect each bus is going to have or has. And then I also write what effect I'm adding or moving around. Also important, especially when working with Koala because it's mapped out quite clearly, but it works the same way if you just put a grid of 16 pads for the SP, but that is writing down all of the different patterns and how you're switching them. So if you're running through this sequence 4 times, I would draw out this sequencer. I would put A times 4, then switch to B times 2, and of course you can switch around live, but just having it mapped out lets you know, okay, this is how long the song is probably going to be, and you're not going to play one part 5 or 7 times, some weird number, and then switch. It helps keep the track flowing. So those are a few different ways to use a 2-sampler setup. In my case, Koala and the SP, but this would work with anything. This is an incredibly powerful setup that you could even just have on your phone and the SP, or you could even just do this with a phone and get rid of the other sampler. But I love this setup. There's a ton of flexibility with it, and I can make these beats basically anywhere, and then I can export them to the SP or keep it on Koala and just jam out using effects. It's a ton of fun. I hope you check it out. If you have this setup or if you've tried this setup, let me know in the comments. Hey, so while I was editing this video, I realized I wanted to add a bit of a bonus tip for going beyond just using a sampler or 2 samplers in a live set. And so that is adding some sort of MIDI sequencer or groovebox that can send MIDI out into another synth or a couple of synths or something like that. The way that I use this sort of setup, I have the circuit sending MIDI to a couple of synths, and then usually it's synced with the SP, or I'll just make sure to press both at the same time, but then the SP is handling all the sampling duty. And if you do some interesting routing like we've been doing with Koala, you can send the circuit signals into the SP, and then the SP can go into the computer, so all those synths can be sampled into the SP. It gives you a ton of flexibility. But yeah, it's just a fun way to evolve beyond just using a sampler for a live set. You can have a little more improvisation by playing synths, but you can also have pre-sequenced parts that you can add in and take out whenever you want using something like the circuit adding circuit sounds or even adding additional synths on the MIDI. If you want to check out how I use some MIDI sequencers, usually the circuit tracks, to send MIDI to synthesizers while playing samples on my SP, check out my live stream series. Every couple of weeks I go live on YouTube and I make some music using my Dallas desk. The MIDI is usually from the circuit and then the SP is handling all the sampling duty. Thanks for watching.